Welcome, Tim, to Texts on Texts. You're our first ever guest, so thank you for doing this with me.
You're welcome.
No, it's really an honor, and it's uncanny, just kind of like how perfect you are as a first guest for this, because you've actually even written your own blog posts about literature that's influenced you, and that's precisely what I'm trying to do here with this project, is showcase the importance of literature on technologists and their careers, and how it's influenced the world that we live in now, that's increasingly mediated by technology. I'm curious to get an update on like how you describe yourself, but also if you consider yourself a technologist.
That's an interesting question. I guess I've never really thought of myself as a, quote, technologist. I've thought of myself as maybe a map maker, a storyteller. I think of myself as maybe a scientist in the sense that I'm trying to make sense of the world around me. I think of a technologist as somebody who uses techne to actually build things, and I don't really do that. I explain things. And a lot of what I explain is technology, but that doesn't make me a technologist.
Interesting. I mean, although I'll push back on that a little bit. I mean, I think you wield technology in pretty interesting ways, but perhaps you're not building technology, but you certainly have wielded technology to do what you do. Is that fair to say?
I think that's true. I've been an early adopter, and in some, fairly important ways, I have been a technology pioneer. I mean, after all, we created the first ad-supported website. We created the earliest web portal. So, I played a pretty major role in getting people to think differently about open source software. But again, I see a lot more of that as what you could call meme engineering than actual software engineering.
Well, I'm going to take a note on this idea of meme engineering, because I think it itself is a great meme. So we'll come back to that. What prompted me to reach out to you was to talk about Dune. You've written a biography, or the biography of Frank Herbert.
The only one. It's not properly speaking a biography. It's really a book about his books with highlights on his life. And I should say it was written in, I think it was 1978. It came out in 1981. I started in 78, so I'm not sure exactly when I finished it. It really goes only up through Children of Dune. For those who are fans of the later books, which I am not particularly.
Same.
Yeah, I first read Dune when I was 11 years old. I still remember bringing it home from the library. I found it at a library that was far enough away that my father had to drive me. And he sees this enormous volume. Let me actually get it down here.
Oh, is this it? Like, this is the book?
No, this is a copy of the same edition.
Oh, yeah, it's not from the library.
The original Chilton,
Wow.
By the way, it's an interesting story there. You realize it was published by Chilton, the car repair manual people.
I didn't.
Frank got rejected by 200 different publishers. But anyway, I was driving home, and my father looks at it, and he said, very conservative Catholic, he says, "It's sinful that so large a book should be devoted to science fiction." I almost used that as a little epigraph when I wrote my book. Anyway, it had a big impact on me in a variety of ways, and I could talk about that if you want.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the point here, is trying to understand how literature shapes people. The funny thing about being like an 11-year-old, my daughter's 11, and I have to constantly remind myself that like my favorite bands I discovered when I was like 11. I'm still obsessed with like that music. I think I read Dune when I was like 14, and I was just fascinated by it. I am curious to know, like,
it's fabulous
what
because
that was like for you.
I mean, there was a class of young adult science fiction. I mean, I started reading science fiction when I was in second grade, and by the time I was 11 or 12, I was reading everything, but still I had a special place in my heart for the kinds of books where the protagonist is a teenager.
Right.
You relate to that. So Andre Norton, books like The Stars Are Ours, which was one of my all-time favorite books, or The Time Traders, which is a time travel novel by Andre Norton, or Heinlein's juveniles like Time for the Stars or A Farmer in the Sky. They all had young adult protagonists that you could really relate to. And Dune is sort of atypical in that it's not actually a young adult science fiction novel, but it does have a young protagonist. To me, there's something about that ability to identify with the hero of a novel. That's very powerful. It lifts you out of yourself. You can identify with that, and I was the sort of the geeky kid, and it was a little bit like the same attraction of Marvel Comics. Wait, there's a lot more to you than everybody thinks, and you see right. Circumstances call out the best in you. And of course, it wasn't that much later. Star Wars came out in 77, so I was like 23,
right?
And I still remember thinking, oh my God. George Lucas, he just nailed that. Here he is. He's got, it's almost like the hero's journey. This kind of kid, and he's just waiting for fate to come along and hand him an adventure and a quest. Anyway, but that was part of what appealed. But there were some other things that really jumped out at me and really became, in a certain sense, part of my character and part of my mental furniture. And one of them is a scene that I didn't think they did sufficient justice to in Dune, in the movie of Dune. And that was the scene where Duke Leto goes down and risks his life to rescue the stranded spice miners. Liet Kynes, or Keynes, I'm not sure how you were supposed to pronounce his name, says he would give his life for them. And it really stuck with me that was a key quality of leadership. You're making a deal with the people who follow you. You're saying, you follow me, and my job is to make it worth your while and to look after you. And that was really reinforced by another book I read a few years later. It was a signed reading, so I would have been maybe 13, going on 14. It was a historical novel called The Golden Warrior, about Harold, the last of the Saxon kings, and who was defeated by William the Conqueror in Normandy. And I still remember I read it in the Lake District in England. We were staying at a place by the headwaters of the River Derwent, which is where actually Harold had fought somewhere further down towards York. Harold had fought off his half-brother Tostig and the Vikings before Williams invaded in the south. Everybody was like, you got to regroup. At least as told in the novel, he's like, no, that's not the deal. He's raping and pillaging. The deal is, you follow me, I protect you. Right. And it just really stuck for me. And I kind of feel like I always took that as kind of a key principle of business. You're asking people to work for you. You have a real responsibility to them if you're asking people to follow you somewhere.
So you feel like you internalized this at 11? Like you were like,
I did.
Understood the contract.
11, 12, 13, 14. It really became a key concept for me. But probably the other thing, and maybe a bigger thing, was I started working with this guy named George Simon, who was, it was actually, at the time he was sort of leading an explorer group about nonverbal communication, but he developed a whole bunch of stuff based on a combination of general semantics and the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. It was a lot about thinking about the future evolution of human consciousness and just the evolution of human consciousness in general. I remember giving him Dune to read because I thought, that's what this is also about. And of course, I grew up in San Francisco in the 60s. My brothers and I remember we were experimenting with psychedelics, and like two of us, we drew lots. So two of us would take the drug, and the other one would take notes.
Oh, perfect. That's great.
That whole idea of the spice unlocking human potential. And reading books like Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, which was, of course, based on that great quote of Blake's, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite. Dune had that very compelling vision of that, but it also had a very compelling vision of how to respond to the future. And actually, I wrote about that. I was actually, just before I pulled down my book to see if I could find this passage that I wrote. The introduction to my book on Frank Herbert is called Dancing on the Edge. In it, I say, it's a general principle of ecology that an ecosystem is stable, not because it is secure and protected, but because it contains such diversity that some of its many types of organisms are bound to survive despite drastic changes in the environment or other adverse conditions. Herbert adds, however, that the effort of civilization to create and maintain security for its individual members, quote, necessarily creates the conditions of crisis because it fails to deal with change. And Uh,
Yeah. Wow.
that I really took in, and I feel like it's always, certainly if you look at my career, it's been a history of looking at the world with fresh eyes and trying to make sense of things as they are rather than as they used to be, and accepting that nothing is permanent. And of course, all kinds of echoes come off of that. I mean, there was much earlier science fiction book called The World of Null A by A.E. Van Vogt, which was about general semantics, which was also about this idea, which I got from George Simon, but which is really about the central idea of Korzybski's, which is the map is not the territory, and we often make mistakes because we get locked in a map, which is a set of abstractions from reality, and we don't look back to see if it's still correct. So I had developed a set of tools working with this guy, George Simon, for training myself to realize when I was in the map and when I was looking at something freshly, and just how do you just sort of step back and let yourself process something. And it was sort of an experiential practice that I had learned with him, and actually helped him teach actually at Esalen when I was 18 years old. But anyway, when I wrote the book, when I was 23, 24, I was reflecting on all of this and kind of telling a story about the world as a place that is radically uncertain. And our job is to find balance. So images like things like surfing or kayaking, or where you're dealing with a turbulent reality and you're responding. And so that became a big part of my mental framing of part of what one needs to do in response to life. Right. And of course, there was another piece of it, which is going far afield from science fiction, which is Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher. Yeah. And he says, let life ripen and then fall. Will is not the way at all. Another great quote is one of his passages talking about the qualities of the wise man. He goes down this list, and then one of them is roiled as a torrent. And he says, why roiled as a torrent? Because sometimes there's nothing to do but wait until the stream clears. How do you get in that space of receptivity so that you can see things as they are and not keep fighting reality? Basically, I've taken in so many of these books that I've read over the years. They become part of your internal language. And part of this idea that language is a map is also language is a toolkit. Right. If you don't have words for a thing, it's very hard to talk about it. That's and once you have words for it, you can see it differently. But we also have to be testing our words. We have to make sure that they mean what we think they mean.
For example, the doors of perception. Great metaphor, great way to sort of describe something like a mystical experience, right? Yeah. If I say the word mystical experience or that phrase, that might mean very different things to different people. I'm a big fan of mystic poetry. Yeah. And I think Dune, I mean, like you've said, like sort of a huge theme of Dune and the spice is that it does engender some kind of mystic experience. It does seem a lot like a psychedelic experience, right? Yeah. That allows you to see the world as it is. But then there's the question, I think what's so interesting about Dune, actually, I have a passage from the introduction to your biography. You really summarize some of the stuff that makes Dune so interesting. You say Dune contains ecology, mysticism, and a kind of hard-headed insistence on the relativity of human perception that limits human knowledge. I'm curious to get your take on that last part. Okay, so you've opened the doors of perception, you've seen the world as it is. Then what do you do with that? Dune has an interesting story to tell about that, I think, but I'm curious to get your take on more about this idea of the limits of human knowledge.
It's kind of interesting because when I hear that passage, I was obviously in some sense synthesizing Frank, but also kind of I was in conversation with him with my own ideas. Because I mean, for example, I know he had studied general semantics as well. Okay. In fact, I remember him telling me there was a professor at San Francisco State, S.I. Hayakawa. And I remember Frank telling me about S.I. Hayakawa leading a nude snake dance down from at Esalen down to the baths.
Oh, man. Good old days.
But so he was familiar with general semantics, but actually the ends of that passage were actually influenced by my reading of Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher, who I read when Frank had told me that the Santa Rosa Barrier was, in many ways influenced by Jasper's. And Jasper's thing was that was ultimately that, we are defined by our limits.
Right.
And we have to, and our ability to confront our limits and look at them squarely, with the limit of death, the limit of what's not possible, and can we live with that, or do we turn away from it and pretend otherwise? And so that was an echo of something I learned through my conversations with Frank in the course of writing the book.
Okay. What are the sort of the practical applications of this? What comes to my mind, I mean, given what I tend to work on is big data and a lot of Earth observation data, where we have instruments that can see wavelengths of light that we can't see with our eyes, right? So we're actually able to create instruments, create technology that lets us see things that we can't see. It extends our limits, our limitations, or it lets us transcend them. But then what, right? So we have more information, but like there is this limit in terms of what we can do. Actually, I'll lead you a little bit here. I know that you're a big fan of Dune Messiah, the book, and I want to get your take on like what can we learn from Paul's story in terms of like, what happens when you actually can see the future? Like what are the implications of that?
Before I go there, let me just sort of say a little bit about this interesting dialogue with reality and our limits.
Right.
Part of our job as human beings is to extend our limits. And part of that means understanding them. I had a great experience of that just last weekend at SciFu, our science foo camp, which we hold with Nature and Google. And Irene Pepperberg was there. She's the woman who has studied parrot speech for many years. And she said that, the parrots fail what they call the mirror test for self-awareness. Like primates will recognize themselves in the mirror.
Right.
And she said parrots. But then she realized that parrots actually, in addition to the three colors that, our primary colors, they also see in the ultraviolet.
Right.
And it occurred to her that maybe they don't recognize themselves because there's no ultraviolet mirror.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, cool, we can fix that.
Yeah.
And I hooked her up with someone from the MIT Media Lab who was there. I said, hey, do you think you build something so that the parrots can see themselves in the extended spectrum? I don't know if it's going to produce anything or not, but you kind of go, oh, you've identified a limit. And then you go, we can push that limit. We can test it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that sort of the bias that it shows, which is like,
yeah, exactly.
I can see myself in a mirror. So anything should be able to see itself in a mirror. And it's like, no, that's an instrument that we built for ourselves.
All we've actually done is identify how dumb we are that we think that we're the only way. And I think about that all the time with my dog. She's like avidly sniffing. Sometimes I'll get down on my hands and knees and kind of try to see if I can smell what she's smelling. And of course I can't. You think, oh my God, our sensorium is so limited, and we live in this narrow little band, and we pretend that it's everything. And obviously we've done pretty well with it as a species, but we don't often have enough perspective, I guess I would say.
Totally agree. I mean, we've done well with it in terms of like our ability to continue to grow as a population.
Yeah. So on to Dune Messiah. So Frank's purpose in Dune was, as he said, he'd always planned to write 3 books. He was trying to tell the story of a Messiah as a way of reflecting back to people that this is the idea of giving over all your trust to somebody else is a bad idea.
Right.
And so it had to go wrong. And so he builds up this superhero, and then the superhero effectively gets trapped. And the particular trap that he's in is, if you can see the future, you try to shape it in such a way that you will pick the best future, and that gets you into a kind of stasis. This work I'd done with George Simon, there was a lot of like trying to let in the unknown, like just kind of, okay, I don't know what I don't know, but I can let it in and let it speak to me anyway. This is part of this distinction between being open to something more than what you've already been able to process and label. And so there I am, we can let this in, and okay, so what is the right choice? Let me try to just intuit it and be open to it, even if I don't know what it is. And and I did experience some of that feeling of stasis that Frank talked about, where you're always kind of, and I had some other friends who were part of, who had also worked with George, and it was something, it was very real to us, that was a real thing he'd put his finger on. And it was another science fiction book, actually, that helped me get out of that. And it's a book that's not all that well known, and it's many ways it's very dated, but very, very formative for me. It's a book called Rissa Kerguelen. The title is the name of the main character. It was, at one point, it was published as a trilogy. It's now usually a single long book. It may well be out of print. One of the volumes was called The Long View, and it played on the trope, which that had used in a lot of science fiction, like as you approach light speed, time goes more slowly for the person near light speed, something that fell out of Einsteinian theory. In this particular here, they have a cold sleep kind of drive, where people put into suspended animation, and what they have to do is they have to set plans in motion and go meet up with them. Yeah,
right.
Which is a different kind of thing. You're going to know that you can't predict the future, but you can kind of anticipate certain things, and you can try to meet up with it. Right. And that became a really important concept for me. I was just starting my company at the time when I read it. I was, my late 20s. And I had that sense of like, oh, I'm going to set some things in motion that are going to take 5, 10, 15 years. And the thing I'm trying to get to, are somewhere out there.
Right.
And that's a different approach than trying to bring it all into yourself and somehow manage it. And that kind of goes back to that theme from that earlier quote of kind of surfing the uncertainty. The other thing that was really great in that book, it was a book in which the Earth was sort of dominated by huge companies with hereditary leadership, where they cloned themselves and they were on forever. And the resistance was small entrepreneurial companies. And that was also very shaping for me. It was like, oh, if you want to make change, don't join the big guys, make your own way. Those two ideas from F.M. Busby's Rissa Kerguelen were pretty big for me. Yeah, and they were in a kind of dialogue with Dune Messiah. The other thing that I have to say, I'm not sure I entirely agree with it, but it always stuck in my head. There's a point in Dune Messiah, and again, I hope I'm not giving away,
it's old enough. I don't care about spoilers.
We don't have to worry about spoilers, but there's a point where Paul says to Duncan Idaho, he's expressing, what do I do? And Duncan says, reward your friends and punish your enemies. And, I know, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it always stuck in my head, certainly the reward your friends. And of course that, again, if you look at the way my mind works, is this spider web of connections, because of course that reminds me of one of my favorite stories from ancient Greece, which is the story of Diogenes meeting Alexander the Great.
I don't know.
Diogenes is the philosopher who lived in a barrel.
What are those?
The cynic, where will I find an honest man? Alexander comes and says, I admire your philosophy. I'd like to give you riches. Diogenes says, look at me. I live in a barrel. What use do I have of riches? And Alexander had the better of the exchange, because he said, have you no friends?
Right.
In some ways, that probably was the seed corn for my, enduring business principle: create more value than you capture. Right. It's like if you have power, use it to benefit others.
But I mean, this is the trap, right? That like that's kind of like how the trap gets set. Mm-hmm. I can imagine, which is that like, so you've built an empire, or like Paul, you're suddenly taking control of an empire. There's a strong conservatism seeps in, because a lot of people are like, okay, this is the way things are and the way they should be, and you have a lot of people kind of becoming dependent on that. And how do you guard against that? How do you remain open?
I have to say, I like to think that there could have been a version of Dune that went a different direction.
Okay.
or of Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, because in the end, we may fail. Basically, Paul, and in particular then his son Leto II, we're going to create this stasis, and then it'll break in a truly explosive way, which remixes the gene pool. It's a big fanciful kind of narrative that I'm a big believer in. We keep trying, and it again brings me to another piece of literature, this wonderful poem from Rilke, which I only read in translation from the German, so I feel justified in doing my own slightly different version of it. It's from a poem called The Man Watching, which I originally read in translation by Robert Bly. And it's about Jacob wrestling with the angel. And there's actually a famous painting by Delacroix in Saint-Sulpice in Paris that I love of this story from the Bible. But in it, Rilke says, what we fight with is so small. And when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated decisively by successively greater things. It actually says greater beings because it's describing angels. But I think, I used this in a talk I did in 2008 at our ETech conference, a talk I called "Why I Love Hackers," and because it's like they're struggling with hard problems and not thinking that they're necessarily going to win,
right?
Versus a lot of what's gone wrong, in my opinion, in Silicon Valley. It's all about getting rich, as opposed to just whereas the most interesting startups have been like, I just want to do this shit. Like when Larry and Sergey started Google, they weren't thinking, oh wow, we can be insanely rich. They were thinking, wow, we could actually make the web more useful, and we have this cool idea for how to do it. Let's give it a try. And that whole and again, this is that going back to this idea that the fundamental goal of humans is to face up to the unknown and to do our best to chip away at it. There's always more. The unknown is infinite. In fact, my friend George Simon, who I referred to earlier, used to say his definition of God was etc., all the rest.
Yeah. I love that. Oh, that's great. No, I mean, it's. I'm so glad you said this, because I mean, this is really. I'll just say it out loud. Like, that's why I wanted to start this project. Is all interesting technology, I do think, is motivated by something very human, like a human curiosity and striving, and sort of like what you mentioned before, like a desire to transcend our limitations. And I also, I feel like it's been lost. I guess throughout my career, I increasingly encounter people that they've been trained to only think about optimizing stuff, or like to crush it, and I just think we're missing out on a lot if we forget the sort of the origins of all of this stuff and why we go about it.
Yeah, and just and it really goes back to this idea of limits. One of our fundamental limits is death, and we know that we can't take it with us. So why are we so obsessed with accumulating more? And again, this gives you another piece of a little view of my literature. I'm a huge fan of Samuel Johnson, the guy who wrote the first dictionary of the English language. That's what he was most famous for. But he was a brilliant essayist. He wrote a poem called "The Vanity of Human Wishes," which is actually a translation of a Latin poem by Juvenal. But he also wrote this short sort of proto novel called Rasselas. And in it, it's basically Rasselas, a prince of Abyssinia, this supposed prince who's kind of goes out to get his education. He's been locked away, and he goes out to get his education in the world. He's traveling with his tutor. And the scene that I most remember is one where they go to Egypt, and his tutor, Imlach, says, "I consider the pyramids to be a monument to the insufficiency of all human enjoyments. He who is built for use till use is supplied must begin to build for vanity." It's funny. I remember I sent Jeff Bezos a copy of Rasselas once.
Oh, wow.
After I had told him about that fabulous passage. That was many, many years ago.
Yeah. Bezos is on record as saying that Remains of the Day is his favorite novel. So maybe one day we'll get him on the podcast to
Yeah, well,
talk
again,
about that.
Jeff is actually a very thoughtful guy. I mean, he used
Clearly.
to come to our eTech conference, and I put on dinners for him with interesting people, and we had the best time. As obviously as Amazon grew, he I don't know whether he changed or just it was the PR strategy or whatever. But we haven't talked in years. But I do have he's very interesting.
Yeah,
and
I'm I don't have to apologize. I'm a big fan. I mean, I spent 8 years at AWS on purpose. I just think AWS is incredible. So
yeah, he's really brilliant.
Yeah, and his first shareholders letter is a great piece of writing. It's an incredible piece of writing. So I'm not just blowing smoke. But I mean, it's that to me again is sort of like, I think one of the things that's so compelling about Dune is that it is, I think to the point you're making, like it's somewhat pessimistic, right? It's quite pessimistic, the whole story, in that like Paul is effectively crushed by the knowledge and the power that he attains because he realizes he's effectively powerless, or that he can't quite control. I mean, just the fact that he knows what's going to happen doesn't necessarily mean that he can control things or make things happen in the right way, or he's not willing to.
See, I don't know. But I never read it as pessimistic.
You think there's another version of Dune that could have gone another way, and I guess I'm curious to.
Well,
describe the two different paths.
Like you keep trying, even though you're going to be defeated, and in some ways you could argue that that's actually what Paul does in Dune Messiah. Basically he sets this thing free. I think I've never quite been comfortable with where it went in Children of Dune.
Right. Well, I mean, and you stopped there, right? You didn't read after that?
I think I read one or two of them, but I wasn't that fond of them.
No, so for what it's worth, I made it through God Emperor of Dune, and I was like, I've had enough.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, for those who are familiar with all the books, they'll be able to follow what we're saying. But I'll just share like sort of my read on the situation, and you can agree or disagree. But this notion that like, so Leto II, effectively, he's just like, no, I'm going to go for it. I can see much farther into the future than anybody else can, and I have a plan that's going to benefit everybody, but it's going to require like generations of suffering or misery or poverty or however you want to characterize it, but you just have to trust me. And again, I didn't really want to read after that because I was like, all right, the writing became pretty boring too. But it does describe, I guess, to my mind, a somewhat pessimistic path, which is the idea that if somebody did attain that kind of power that they could control the universe in that way, they would be, they might be willing to make decisions that were inhumane. I don't think it makes sense to trust somebody like that.
I think that's right. And I mean, people have in fact made that choice.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's even been, again, it's not like it's unalloyed bad. You look at Genghis Khan, like brutal, but built, kind of a civilization that was actually pretty good. Once he conquered everybody, he kind of built a pretty good thing. It was one of the most successful civilizations for some number, hundreds of years. You could argue the same thing with Rome. You could even argue the same thing with the Pax Americana. We've done some stuff that's so. Yeah. I think there's some truth to that, but I guess I just still kind of felt like, I mean, some of it was just personal. Like I loved some of the characters. Like it was hard to see Paul thrown away, hard to see Alia thrown away. I loved her. She reminded me of my little sister Kate when I was, when I first was reading those books. Kate's 16 years younger than me, and she was is that 6? No, not 16. 12 years younger than me. When she was born, I was just the right age to be the babysitter, And so she was really my first kid in a certain way.
And she reminded you of Leah?
She was very, as were my daughters, very prescient and very
Yeah.
very adult in a certain way. It was like, oh yeah, I recognize that little girl.
Yeah.
And it was painful to have her turn into somebody who became something of a villain. There's one other thing I want to talk about with this that's just sparked in my mind by
Sure.
this reference to Leto II
Yeah.
and his style of leadership. There's a series of historical novels that I read and truly love by a Scottish writer named Dorothy Dunnett. She wrote two series. The first one has 6 books in it, and the first book is called The Game of Kings. And they're about a Scottish, minor nobleman named Francis Crawford of Lyman. And I remember it turned out Larry Wall, the creator of Pearl, his wife was a huge Dorothy Dunnett fan also. And her description of the book, she says, it's just kind of like Larry, he's just smarter than everyone around him, and what's it like to be, smarter than everybody else. So Lyman always, he sees things, he knows what has to be done. He knows that other people aren't going to be able to see it. This is in Pearl's heyday. Larry really was like that. He was just like, yeah, I'm going to do things differently. And, but it was very influential for me that, like, as a kind of guide to leadership, that you're not always going to be liked. Sometimes you're going to have to actually say, okay, I know something, I believe something, I'm going to act on it. You're just going to have to trust me. Or in the case of Lyman, he basically would just go, okay, I'm going to do this thing, and everybody thinks I'm the bad guy. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, you have to be.
Times when, as a leader, even in business, you have to take that position.
Oh, absolutely. You have to say no all the time. You might have to lay people off.
But you have to make hard choices. Yeah, exactly. You have to make hard choices.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just part of the package. But then actually, let's go back to the story of Leto the First, putting himself in harm's way. Are there examples of this? Like what is the equivalent of you putting yourself in the path of a sandworm with your team?
Well, I don't think
you've owned your business, so
no, I've never had an opportunity for that. But like when with the .com bust was, I'd always had that had led me down the path of a very paternalistic kind of approach to business. And after the .com bust, it was do layoffs or the whole company dies, and we had to lay off 25% of our staff. Still remember, looking at these books of names. I looked down, there's all this hair on my binder. Like my hair was literally falling out as I was so stressed by it, but I had to do it. But first thing I did was, I ended up making a personal guarantee for the loan, whatever loans I could get on the company. And I didn't take a salary for 2 or 3 years, So it was kind of like, okay, I got to lay these people off, but I'm going to take as much of the pain on as I can.
Yeah. No, and it's a terrible thing to have to lay people off. I mean, I know. And it's the kind of thing that, again, as a leader, also, like, no one feels sorry for the guy laying people off, right? As they shouldn't. They're the one that's not having, like, such a horrible day, but it's a really awful thing. And that's part of the
it's very painful.
Yeah.
But, so it's not quite the same. It's not the same thing at all.
It's not a sandworm. Yeah.
Well, but it's not kind of these guys who, we have, like if you look at the typical CEO narrative in America, we must cut costs. Thank you. Let me take my, multi-$100 million pay package.
Right. There's the very clear difference there. Exactly. Yeah. And it's not to me, I'll just say it for myself. It doesn't seem like a fair agreement that I would want to enter into. So you mentioned this. I want to go back to what you're saying about this kind of like setting the course for the future and then meeting up with it later. You told a story. I mean, just when I was many years ago, it was like 2012 when I was in the Code for America Accelerator. I think it was around then. You told a story about your Unix bibliography,
Oh yeah.
which I think is a really good practical example of like how to apply that lesson. Can you tell that story? I'd love to hear it again from you.
Oh, I'm not quite sure which lesson you're thinking it's an application of. I think it's an application of create more value than you capture. Uh, it was I had this notion, our books were just getting adopted in bookstores.
Yeah.
Most of the computer books at the time were about personal computers, and books on Unix and C programming and the like were sort of considered professional books, and they were sold in far fewer stores. They had what was called short discounts, so bookstores didn't buy very many of them. And we actually lucked into this because we were so, one of the things that was great about us was we weren't publishers, so we didn't know what to do. So when we first started talking, we originally sold our books by mail order, direct mail. And then when we got discovered by bookstores, we were like, okay, what kind of discounts do you guys get?
Right.
And they told us their steepest discounts. And so we started selling our books at those discounts. And they started, so they bought a lot of them. It's like the competitive books. If there's two $30 books and one of them they make $15 on and the other they make $8 on, they're going to go, wow, we'll sell a lot more of the one that we make more money on. We can discount it. We can do whatever. So we were really, all of a sudden getting a lot of attention. But I thought, well, there's not a lot of bookstores still don't really understand that there's a lot of demand for this stuff. Unix, the X Window system, then like the internet. And I thought, well, let me make a giveaway, which is a little pamphlet about, here's a bibliography of the best books on Unix and the X Window system. And I thought, well, I'm going to go list all the best books, including from my competitors. Because after all, I know we're not going to take over the world. Let's just sell the category. And so I still remember going and talking to, my competitors and saying, I want to list this. And they would all go, oh, well, this is my latest book. Put the latest book in. No, I go, no, the Henry McGilton book on Unix is way better than that one. I'm putting the old one in, but the point was they were sort of shocked that I was doing this promotional piece that wasn't just for my books, but was for their books as well.
Right.
And again, it's just more of this create more value than you capture. The whole idea of like tell a story that helps everybody, make the pie bigger.
Right.
And that. So I always tried to do that in my business. And I, it was even things too, like people would say, and this is particularly true in the early days. Now it's probably less true of the company, but go, why don't you have a book on such and such? And I go, oh, because there's already a good one out there from, this competitor.
Right.
Why would we want to do another one? There's too many things that have no good books. So we're gonna focus on just filling out the stuff that people need.
Right.
And that was really a kind of mission for us was who can we help?
Right. Well, no, it's beautiful. And I mean, you told that story again, and this is like 10 years ago, more at this point, but it stuck with me. But I guess the lesson that I took from it is more of this kind of like creating the future also. Like you created the wave, like you did your part to create like the Unix wave, and you were situated to catch that wave. But in any event, there was this idea that like you had the foresight to see that like these books needed to exist in the world and more people needed to read them.
I don't think
that happen.
It was that.
No.
Foresight suggests that we were expecting an outcome. We're gonna later on. Certainly, I would say I did some of that, but at that point, our first print runs of our first books on Unix were 100 copies.
It's a very small way.
It was just like there's no good documentation on this thing. Let's make it. The other thing, it was very funny. We were very idealistic. I remember in the early days when we first started our mail order book business. This is before the days of taking money, and people would actually have to send us a check. It was you couldn't. You didn't really have We didn't have any ability to take credit cards. There was not a provision, we weren't even doing it over the internet. It was, or maybe it was email. And we would just basically, people would order the book and we'd say, send us a check. And we put the book in the mail before we got the check. Right. And I don't think we ever didn't get paid.
Yeah. Oh man.
It was just like, it was just this trust. And later on, of course, we really got a sense of just how badly people were hungering for this content. And then we kind of got more convinced of the size of the market. But in the beginning, it was just, we were a tech writing consulting company. And when we had downtime, we thought we might as well do something useful.
Right.
So we started writing manuals for software that we were using that didn't have any good manual.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. It worked out well, clearly.
Yeah.
Actually, you just reminded me of something else. So I was reading these posts that you've written about science fiction and about the books that have shaped you. And in the post about the books that have shaped you, you mentioned Rissa Kerguelen, which you already mentioned.
Yeah.
Kerguelen, sorry. But you say the book gave you the courage to submerge yourself in the details of a fundamentally trivial business, technical writing, and to let go of your earlier hopes of writing deep books that would change the world. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Do you still believe it's a fundamentally trivial business?
No. Obviously, it became very meaningful, but at the time, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I'd had this idea. I'd done this work with George Simon. I went to Harvard to study classics because I was really, it's sort of interesting because the whole idea of Web 2.0, which was a kind of, we are building a global brain, mediated by technology, for me in the 70s was we are heading towards a global consciousness that's mediated by some kind of spiritual, awakening or whatever.
Right.
And I thought I was writing about that, I was going to be, that was what I was going to be doing. Sort of ironic that I did end up becoming if you like, the prophet of global consciousness, just, mediated by technology rather than by, there's some kind of spiritual awakening.
Yeah. I still think we're due for a spiritual awakening, but
we are
topic. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. So you did, at that point in your career, you did have this ambition. You say, you wanted to write deep books that would change the world. But what you're saying is ultimately you still ended up doing that.
Well, except it wasn't really the books that I did. I think the most influential things I didn't actually write as books. Again, I take that back. Clearly the books that we wrote and published played a pretty enormous role in enabling the internet. Back in 2000, when Publishers Weekly had a cover that said the internet was built with O'Reilly books. Nobody thought that was an outrageous claim. It was true. We had a lot of people who started, giant internet companies who said, "Oh yeah, I started with some O'Reilly books," and we in that sense, yes. But the things that I did that like convening the open source summit, where the term open source was adopted, and sort of spreading the narrative that this wasn't about some rebel movement that was hostile to commercial software. It was the foundation of the next generation of commercial software and commercial businesses. It was a sort of a new map. Web 2.0. What is it about the companies that survived the .com bust? It was a new map. Gov 2.0. What is it? What does it look like if government starts acting like a platform? That was a new map. So all of those things were, effectively short form manifestos and PR work, and the term I used earlier was meme engineering, telling a story about how to make sense of the world differently.
Yeah. No, I was actually going to bring that back up. This notion of meme engineering. I would say like Gov 2.0 has been a huge part of my career. Has been working in like the Gov 2.0 world, which is a concept that I guess you made up, right?
Yeah.
And can you talk about this idea of meme engineering? Do you have a strategy, or do you just?
Well, at the time, it was just a reflection of how I worked, which was you look at the world and you tell a story about it.
Right.
It was also a big piece of it were a set of skills that I learned from a guy named Brian Irwin, who came to work for us as our head of PR in 1992, back when we first published the whole Internet Users Guide and Catalog. He had been the director of activism for the Sierra Club.
Oh.
And he had been commuting from Santa Rosa down to San Francisco, and he wanted to have a local job where he didn't have to commute. He discovered that we had this job, and he really invented a lot of influencer marketing techniques that are still practiced today. You go find the influencers, and at that point it was Usenet. But the other thing he did was I remember him saying to me, people don't care about your book or our books.
Yeah.
He said they care about the topic of our books. So we're not going to sell the books. We're going to sell the subjects. And that's really where I got that from Brian. So we went on, my first ever kind of PR tour was the Internet is coming. The Internet is coming.
Right.
And we were using, the whole Internet Users Guide and Catalog to sell the Internet. And then we created, things like GNN, the Global Network Navigator, and Internet in a Box as products to help accelerate the adoption of the Internet. And then, of course, a lot of my activism after that was about why, we needed the web to continue to be peer-to-peer, why we needed everyone to have a web server, not just be web browsers pointing at big central servers. And that led me down a path. And then, of course, open source software. And then, I started thinking, I kept thinking about the meaning of open source software, and I was dissatisfied with the narrative that it had to do with some special kind of license, because I had been around, Berkeley Unix, which was, first of all, a very, very open license, and secondly, was a large, worldwide collaborative community enabled by Usenet and actually sending mag tapes around, with a license that was owned and controlled by AT&T, originally. And I said, well, clearly, if you can have that kind of incredibly dynamic, community of software developers creating shared software, contributing, it can't just be about license, because AT&T's license was nothing. There were permissive practices. So I started telling a story about how this is really, has much more to do with the Internet, with how people are sharing differently and how they're able to collaborate differently, how they're able to connect differently. And I kept thinking about that and following that thread. And then that led me down the path to, how the Internet was more and more changing software development. And then I came to this idea that, I read things and I take them in and go, oh, somebody just gave me another piece of the puzzle. In that particular case, there was a guy named Dave Stutz who had been he'd been an open source lead at Microsoft, doing various things, and he left and he wrote this farewell letter to Microsoft, which was about why they should be embracing the commodification of software. And I thought, oh, that's another one of these things, collaboration, community, commodification, and I started thinking about how software was being commoditized. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how the PC had, in some ways, commoditized hardware, which had been the source of IBM's lock-in. And I went, oh, okay, so the Internet and, open source and free software are commoditizing the kind of software universe that Microsoft controlled. What comes next? And of course, that led me to, well, when the Internet is a platform, it's going to be a platform that's about data. In some sense, if the Internet is becoming an operating system, it's going to be a data operating system. It's going to be about identity, about location. And so I started thinking about data and came up with principles like data is the new Intel inside. Started talking about big data, started talking about distributed computation, and how all these things were aspects of this new Internet as platform. And then, of course, Dale Doherty came up with the name Web 2.0, which is when it really took off.
Okay, amazing. This is incredible. You just remind. I had a conversation with Mark Surman maybe like a year ago. So he's the executive director of Mozilla. But it's about a lot of what you were just saying about like open source license, like the license being like not the whole story, right? And that's increasingly true as people interact with software that's just run on somebody else's server over over the web. And so you heard it here first. I'm going to start the Web 2.1 movement. We got to like ditch all the like the Web3 stuff and go back and keep having these conversations, because we're all using software as a service now, and it's amazing. A lot of it's built on open source tooling, but the way that these services are governed and managed is completely inscrutable, and
well, the
oftentimes
thing that's
not
really
great.
this is really the big frontier of open source today is LLMs, and this is
Yeah,
you have the big centralized systems that are being run by OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft, and then you have Facebook has ended up getting behind smaller models, that can be distributed and open source, and
yeah,
it's sort of interesting because the big guys are saying, doing a lot of FUD. You actually this has to be regulated because, and only
yeah,
the big guys can regulate it because it's such a dangerous technology. And I have to say, I think there are some risks, but it's really being overblown. I think it's being overblown by people who have a vested interest in having this be big and centralized and under the control of a few players. Rather than decentralized, because it is a very disruptive technology and it is potentially a reset. And I first started thinking about this when at O'Reilly we built a search engine we called O'Reilly Answers against the content on our platform, which is tens of thousands of ebooks, tens of thousands of hours of video, and we'd always had a Solr based, Solr being an old open source search engine technology, and it was always like whack-a-mole, and suddenly, with machine learning, you could build, a plain language search engine that would take you right to the paragraph that you were looking for, right to the minute of a video. And I went, whoa, this is super disruptive. For the first time in 20 years, we can search our own content better than Google can. And I thought, wow, this is really potentially very disruptive. And then, of course, out came ChatGPT, and everybody was like, yeah, this is it's really going to change the game. And we're really just in the early stages of, this is like when Jim Allchin was, Microsoft was saying open source is a cancer, and everybody's like, oh, these small open source large language models are really dangerous. They're going to destroy everything. We need to, and I guess, again, that would, be something else that's a big part of what I do is pattern recognition. And I go, there's no guarantee that the pattern will repeat, but it sure looks suspicious.
Yeah, no, and a lot of, I think a lot of the arguments in case of like in favor of open source software in terms of security and just the ability to scrutinize what's going on in there are obviously applicable to these models.
Yeah. Well, but also just the power asymmetry. It's so like if a few big guys have enormous power and they're basically denying that power to individuals and to smaller companies, we all become clients. And that's, to me, there's a very interesting thing here, because an LLM in some sense is obviously they capture the state of the internet at a particular point in time.
Right.
But they capture a huge amount of the knowledge that's been on the internet, which before you needed someone like Google to search. And now it's sort of there encapsulated in the model. And then if you can ground the model in in our case with professional content that's been vetted, you actually can get better results than you can, the example I always use, like, okay, if you were trying to get legal advice, do you want it to be coming from Reddit, or do you want it to be coming from, Westlaw?
Right.
And you may want to have the thing trained on Reddit so it can understand the questions, but you want to have the answers come from actual legal citations, and not ones
from
that
something
made up.
Yeah, something that doesn't hallucinate. It's funny. I actually asked ChatGPT. I'm like, which technology leaders have read Dune? And it was like, oh, Jeff Bezos loves Dune. Steve Jobs loves Dune. And it had all these stories about like Steve Jobs. It said something like Steve Jobs used to like quote it in meetings. There's no evidence of this anywhere. Like I went and actually tried to search to find this, and it's like ChatGPT was so confident. It's like, oh yeah, like obviously Steve Jobs loves Dune. It's hilarious. But this actually brings me, I want to sort of bring this back to the Rilke poem, which I love. I mean, like we talked before we recorded, you mentioned I went and read it. It's a spectacular poem. This notion that we should be grappling with huge problems and and the only way to grow is by letting ourselves, I mean, it may not necessarily letting ourselves be defeated, but by like straining ourselves against these kinds of things. And this might be a little hyperbolic, but like I do feel like these large language models are, and just advances we're seeing in AI, we are confronting technology that we can't quite understand anymore. Like we can't program it. And I'm curious if you see like a parallel there. Like, are we creating like megafauna that we're going to have to contend with?
I don't
and is
know.
that a good or bad thing?
I guess I think the notion of we can't explain these things, we can't control them, it's just overstated. You know, I mean, for the average person, the systems that we have, nobody can control anyway.
Right.
I mean, you know, there's all kind. You know, you just look at any system made with our existing programming techniques. There are so many interactions and so many layers that it's impossible for anyone to be able to understand all of it or to fix it. It takes massive amounts of work. There's you know, and to me, there's some aspects. First of all, you can program. You look at some of the prompts that people are writing. They're really small programs, and I think you're going to get a lot better at effectively programming these things. I think that we are going to figure out, I mean, how to get better at creating ones that are more reliable. I mean, this reminds me a lot of the narrative about the early web, for example, that everybody looked at it and said, but look, it's, the UI is crappy. Oh, look, the latency is bad. Oh, look, and you kind of go, did you not read Clayton Christensen? This is a disruptive technology. It's not a sustaining technology, and yes, it will start out being worse at many things.
Right. Yeah.
But it'll get better faster than we expect. And I guess the other thing that you see consistently throughout all of the history of technology is it's human machine symbiosis. It's not human replacement. And maybe one day we can imagine that we'll get to replacement. But is that, I mean, I guess, when I think about that, I go, okay, you can look at a bicycle very clearly as an augmentation of a human, like slowly, pedal powered. An automobile, it's a little bit more like, no, this is just a device, right? And we control it, right?
Yeah.
But then you get to a big airliner, and you go, well, somebody else controls it, maybe. I remember I was on somebody's private plane once, and I was up there. I won't say whose it was up there, and I said, "Oh, yeah, we're up cruising above the clouds," and I go, I guess this is where you have it on autopilot. You just have to take off and land. And he says, no, it's the other way around. This is where we get to fly. If you're going to a busy airport, the autopilot is what takes off and lands the plane.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's always the case, but certainly we as humans are just along for the ride. And that'll be true for a lot of people in the age of AI. But the net is it's an augmentation. Right. Even so. Even though it's not, like compare a bicycle where it's literally, it's very directly augmenting me, but like, hey, it's an augmentation that I can get to Europe in 10 hours from San Francisco, and nobody understands, with their smartphone, they're not kind of going, oh my God, this is terrible. It's like, this could misdirect me. Yeah. Oh my God. And they say things like, oh my God, I'm, being tracked all the time by Google, but they don't, it's sort of interesting. Again, that goes back to like the narrative about privacy seems wrong to me, because the issue isn't, are they tracking me? The issue is, what are they doing when they track me? In the case of Google with Maps, they're working for me. In the case
Right.
of, say, my credit card selling my location to an advertiser, maybe they're not working for me. If my car were to report me to my insurance company, you kind of go, well, that's kind of not working for me. So, we're not
Right.
even asking the right questions about these technologies.
Totally agree.
We have a
Yeah.
narrative that is making us afraid rather than making us like look at the strengths, the weaknesses, and how to apply the technology more effectively
Right.
to achieve
Actually,
our goals.
right. Well, now, and I'll add, I mean, to your points about like people not understanding the technology we have now and us being sort of at the mercy of it. The same thing applies to like capitalism, like just the markets that like dominate our lives, or American democracy, or any other kind of governing system. Like they're inscrutable to most people, and it's not like any one person can control them.
Uncontrollable. I mean, that's I think
they can't. Right.
And that's why I love this Charlie Strauss term where he said, Cory Doctorow uses the same concept. That corporations, governments, all institutions are simply slow AIs. They are artificial intelligence.
That's a good one.
I see my wife Jen Palka's book behind you on the shelf.
Yes, of course.
Which is all about why government is so hard to control, and nobody can manage all the layers. There's hundreds of years of accumulated cruft, and we can start to figure out how to get back in the driver's seat, but we're not in the driver's seat now.
No.
For so many things. But anyway, all this kind of comes back around to the big challenges. We shouldn't despair. We just need to tackle these big challenges, and with all the tools at our disposal, and do our damnedest to solve them. I do think that there's a really interesting time coming up, because the challenges that are coming at us are so large. Climate change is obviously the biggest, but climate change brings with it political instability, mass migrations, challenges in agriculture, clean water. It's not just energy, it's not just wildfires, it's warfare, and effectively that our interconnected world. Boy, I'll tell you, one of the things that AI can really help us with is actually managing some of those things. One of my favorite quotes from a guy named Paul Cohen. I used to be the AI program manager at DARPA. He was a professor at University of Pennsylvania, maybe. But he said the opportunity of AI is to help humans model and manage complex interacting systems. We need to get better. There's actually a really, really good book I just read recently. I mean, it's got a simple idea. It's called The New Goliaths. And I thought it was going to be a book about the big tech giants, but it really isn't. It's about industry concentration across all industries being enabled by IT. And he has the fundamental idea he has is that in the modern economy, management of complexity is kind of the economic frontier. The people who are best at managing complexity are the winners, and which I thought was very, very interesting thesis. I'm trying to remember the name of the author. It's just gone out of my head. His name is James Besson. Okay. He also wrote a book called Learning by Doing, which I really liked. It was about the Industrial Revolution and skilled labor versus unskilled labor. Anyway, let's leave it with kind of. I want to bring it back around to Frank Herbert, because
let's bring it around. We can wrap it up.
If we were to take a lesson from Frank Herbert and put it together with that James Besson idea about managing complexity, Frank would tell us that we don't want to manage the complexity out of complexity. We want to surf the wave of complexity, kind of ride it. I remember that was actually one of the things that Frank told me when I told him I was writing a book about Dune. And, I had met him on the road, when he was doing interviews or whatever. And he said, and whether it was maybe it was his granddaughter, said, whatever you do, don't dullify it. and I think that's he told me that story. And I kind of feel like, that's our opportunity. How do we use these technologies to, exalt in the complexity, in a way that a surfer exalts in the complexity, the way that a skier exalts in the complexity, the way that we exalt in the complexity in our lives, rather than trying to tame it. It's like these are tools to help us balance, to help us ride the waves, to help us navigate. And I think we have the possibility to give ourselves the superpowers that we need.
I love that. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah. I'm really glad to have you on.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Right. Thanks a lot for having me, Jed.
Wow. I loved that conversation. I recorded that a little over 6 months ago on July 18th, 2023. I'm recording this on February 5th, 2024. My original plan was to get this out the door in September of last year in advance of Dune Part 2. But fortunately, kind of, for me, the writer's strike pushed the release date back, and I got a little extra time to figure out how hard it is to start a podcast. But here we are, and if you're listening to this, I just want to say thank you. This is a real labor of love for me. I actually did start this podcast because I believe that by talking about literature, we can create better technology. If you enjoyed this, I just want to share a few ideas of how you can help. The first thing you could do is share this with somebody who you think would find it interesting. That's how I want to grow this audience. You can also leave a review wherever you leave reviews for podcasts. And if you want to reach out to me directly and send me feedback directly, you can at jed@textontexts.net. If you really want to show some support, we actually don't have any way to donate financially. I don't have a Patreon or anything like that. I also don't want to allow any advertising on this podcast. This, to me, is a public service, and it's something that I want to do just because I think it's important, and I want to have these conversations. But if you really insist on opening your wallet, I encourage you to instead donate to Radiant Earth. My day job is as executive director of Radiant Earth. We're a nonprofit focused on making Earth science data more accessible to more people and easier to use. We're hoping that will accelerate sustainability research and other kinds of environmental research. If that sounds interesting to you, you can go to radiant.earth. And if you want to donate, you can go to radiant.earth/donate. And then finally, this is maybe a long shot, but I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to manifest, as they say these days. If you or anyone you know has grants that they offer to support humanities education and engagement with the humanities, I would love to hear from you about that. Again, it's jed@textontexts.net. If you want to email me, it's jed@textontexts.net. I want to, again, thank Tim O'Reilly for being so gracious and so generous with his time. Really, that conversation was a tremendous gift to me. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. My intro music is by Secret School, and the outro music is a song called 3/10 of the Population by We. And I will be including links to them and a few other things that Tim and I talked about in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and I hope to see you in about a month. Bye.